Welcome to the Happier Lives Institute's Wellbeing course. In this course, we are going to cover why measuring well-being is important, the history of well-being, how we measure it and what the WELLBY is, whether we can trust measures of well-being, some common questions we often get about well-being, how we translate well-being data into cost effectiveness, and finally, practical tips for implementing well-being data collection. Okay, video 5, calculating cost effectiveness. Now we're getting to the good stuff. At this stage, you should understand why we measure well-being, how we measure it, and why it's a valid and reliable measure. And we compare different charities or interventions in well-being years, or WELLBYs. So as a reminder, I ask you how satisfied you are with your life, 0 to 10, and you said a 6. Then you went up to 7 for 1 year, that's 1 WELLBY. But we can't just look at how much a charity improves or an intervention improves well-being. So let's say charity A created 1,000 WELLBYs and charity B created 10,000. So which does more good? Maybe you said charity B, but now let me add some new information. Charity A has a budget of $10,000 and charity B has a budget of $5 million, or 500 times that. So this is why we have to think about effects and costs, overall cost effectiveness. So bigger charities might have a larger impact overall, but a lower impact per dollar. And for donors, we think it's the impact per dollar they should really care about. If you want to make a difference for other people's lives, you've got scarce resources, you have to focus on your impact per dollar. The formula to calculate impact per dollar looks pretty easy. It would just be total WELLBYs produced divided by total costs of the organization. But in reality, there is of course a lot more detective work involved. So calculating costs is often fairly straightforward. It just includes everything that a charity spends to run its programs. But I should add that we prefer to look at total WELLBYs produced and total costs. So charities will say things like, it costs just $5 to provide this or that. But that can often be misleading. They'll be talking about the marginal costs. That's the cost once everything else is paid for. But donors collectively have to foot the bills for those costs too. So here's an example. I mean, you could say it would have cost Neil Armstrong nothing to take a few more steps on the moon.
It's 1 small step for man, 1 giant leap for mankind.
But of course, it cost him a huge amount of money to get him there in the first place. The average cost for each step on the moon was probably hundreds of millions of dollars. So looking at total impact divided by costs is a good sense check to look at overall cost effectiveness. But costs are generally the easier part. The real challenge lies in accurately estimating the number of WELLBYs that a program produces. And that's where the magic happens. So step 1 is estimating the individual impact. So first we need to figure out how much an intervention improves someone's well-being and for how long. So say a cash transfer boosts someone's life satisfaction from a 4 out of 10 to a 5 out of 10. Great, but does that effect last? Or does it start fading after a few months? Just like the excitement from a raise quickly turns into just another paycheck. So economists call this decay, the idea that effects shrink over time. And how that happens matters. Does life satisfaction drop at a steady rate? That would be a linear decay. Does the drop happen early on and then level out, which would be an exponential decay? Or is there some other pattern? Maybe it grows over time. So to figure this out, we need high quality evidence with relatively regular follow-ups over a suitable time period. So we'll discuss that more a bit later in this video and also in the next video. Step 2 is considering spillover effects. So have you ever lived with someone who was constantly in pain, physically or mentally? Yes, I mean, did their happiness affect yours? It probably did. We are social creatures and being around other people who are doing well or doing badly affects us, especially if we love them. And of course, it's the same with the kind of programs that charities run. Programs don't just affect one person, they ripple out. Often a case for charity depends on its ripple effect in the community. A mental health program won't just help one person, it could lift up their entire household. So to recognize this, we add to the individual effects the extra amount of well-being to affect the impact that the individual intervention will have on members of the household. By including these broader effects, we get a more complete picture of a program's total impact. So in practice, looking at spillovers is a relatively new area, something that few interventions have data on. However, for those charities that we do have this data for, we find that spillovers are pretty important. So some interventions have more spillover effects than others. So for example, one charity we looked at provides therapy and cash transfers to men to encourage them to commit fewer crimes. And we estimate that the majority of the impact comes from the benefit to the community, not to the individual themselves who's committing fewer crimes. But there are other programs like cash transfers where we expect the impacts to happen more kind of locally to the individual and their family rather than the wider community. And this is something that you want to try and look at to see what is the total effect of what an NGO is doing. We hope the research into spillovers grows exactly so we can have more information on this. So not all studies are equally good. Our job is to sort the gold from the fool's gold. And the usefulness of the evidence depends on two key factors. So one is generalizability. How relevant is a study to an evaluated charity's real intervention? Is the study based on the same kind of intervention? Was it conducted on a similar population? How long was the follow-up? Do we have to guess the rate of decay over time, or do we have data on it? Replicability, so how trustworthy is the study? Do we expect the study, if it happened again, it would replicate? Was there a control group, and were people randomly assigned into the treatment and control group? This kind of study is called a randomized controlled trial, or RCT, and it's considered the gold standard of evidence, or one of the gold standards of evidence. You might ask if the study was pre-registered. This can reduce bias from changing things after the fact. And after, are there any red flags like small sample size, conflicts of interest, high attrition? So yeah, like I say, a kind of gold standard piece of evidence is the randomized controlled trial. And this method, the RCT, is what's used in medicine to test drugs. People are put into one group, the control group who gets nothing, or a placebo, or maybe the next best treatment, and there's a treatment group who does get the intervention. And this randomization allows us to infer causality, and it's now increasingly used out of medicine in fields like development economics. However, it is not always easy to find randomized controlled trials of exactly the sorts of interventions that we want to look at. So instead, we often have to piece together evidence from similar interventions and then conduct what is known as a meta-analysis of the data. A meta-analysis is a study of studies. It's a method for combining data from multiple sources to get a more meaningful estimate. So as a rule of thumb though, the weaker the evidence that goes into this meta-analysis, the harsher the adjustments or discounts we need to apply to it. So this means that charities that provide better data normally rewarded by having their impact not adjusted or not adjusted by as much. So good data is important. And the reason we do this is because we have to be conservative. We don't want to get carried away and just hope things work. So for instance, if we don't have long-term data to estimate the impact over time, we will assume the least generous while also plausible model. And conducting meta-analyses are time-consuming for us, and the results may not even be as strong as if we had really good direct evidence. That means that if two charities approach us and we think their likelihood of providing effective interventions is similar, but one has a large, well-run charity-specific study, we'll have a preference for analysing that one. So step 4, adjusting for real-world differences. After adjusting the data for strength, we might apply other adjustments to account for real-world differences. For example, let's say we're looking at cash transfers, but the best study we have is based on $1,000 transfers, while the charity in question provides $200 cash transfers. If we use the evidence from the $1,000 transfer study, we might be overestimating the effect. So we will account for this and try to scale down the expected impact. This kind of adjustment happens all the time, although they are rarely so simple. We want to try and make sure we're comparing apples to apples so we can get a sensible picture of the real impact. And that gets us to step 5, which is calculating cost effectiveness. So once we've estimated the individual impact of an intervention, WELLBYs per person, the spillover effects on others, the appropriate adjustments that we need to reflect our uncertainty in how this program is delivered, and the number of people affected, we can then combine the intereffects on the individual and the spillover and multiply the number affected, and this is how we will get the total WELLBYs generated from what a program is doing. And then, because we're doing costs and effects, we have to divide the total number of WELLBYs generated by the total costs of the organisation, and then we will often multiply this by 1,000 to get the WELLBYs generated per $1,000. You may see that we sometimes present cost effectiveness as dollars to produce a WELLBY. This doesn't change the ranking of cost effectiveness programs, just switching things around, but it's sometimes a more intuitive way of presenting the same information. Just be sure to remember that while a higher number of WELLBYs per $1,000 is better, when it comes to cost per WELLBY, a lower number is going to indicate higher cost effectiveness, which hopefully is reasonably intuitive. Okay, step 6. What about charities with multiple programs? What if a charity runs many things, but we're only really interested in one part of what it's doing? Well, in this case, looking at the total costs for the charity in this equation will make a program look unfairly cost ineffective. So to account for this, we will often use the program specific costs and then adjust these total costs to reflect the appropriate proportion of the overheads so that each intervention is evaluated fairly. In theory, counting cost effectiveness is simple, but the devil is often in the details. The numbers might look clean in paper, but the challenge is spotting strong evidence, making fair comparisons, and adjusting for uncertainty. With cost effectiveness analyses of any variety, well-being or not, they're always part science, part informed judgment call. And you might be wondering, well, if the numbers aren't precise, what's the point? Well, if we were only comparing programs that we thought might be 2 or 3 times better than others, that would be a problem. The uncertainty would make it hard to say which is really better. It would be within the margin of error. But that's actually not what we find. So we recently published the first global comparison of charities in the World Happiness Report. We compared them, of course, in terms of WELLBYs per dollar, and what we found that the best intervention was about 1,000 times better than the least good. We didn't actually look at we didn't have any charities that were negative. And we found the average of the top charities was about 150 times more cost effective than the average of the UK charities. So the gap is so staggeringly large that even with uncertainty and a wide margin for error, we can still say with confidence which programs deserve greater priority. But to compare smaller differences, you do need much better data. In the next section, we'll share some practical tips for collecting good wellbeing data, avoiding common pitfalls, and most importantly, how the Happy Lives Institute can help you become a charity that doesn't just guess at its impact, but leads the way in improving lives. So come back for our final episode.